For weeks, missiles dominated the headlines. Now diplomats are trying to do something much harder: build a peace. Behind closed doors, negotiators are discussing a possible framework: reopening the Strait of Hormuz, phased sanctions relief, limits on Iran's nuclear activities, verification mechanisms, security guarantees, and perhaps most difficult of all, convincing both sides that the other can be trusted. Supporters say this could become the foundation of a lasting settlement. Critics say it is merely a temporary pause before the next crisis. So what would it actually take to turn today's ceasefire into tomorrow's peace? Tonight, 5 retired spies examine the current negotiations, the obstacles standing in the way, and whether this fragile ceasefire can survive. Let's begin. Back with us tonight, Texas Buck McCoy, Colonel Dimitri the Bear Volkov, Madam Li Wei, Sir Reginald Hawthorne, Lukas the Vault Brunner, 5 retired spies, 5 very different worldviews. Before we discuss whether peace is possible, let's examine what is actually on the negotiating table. Both sides say they want peace. The problem is that they want very different things. Lukas, start us off.
The broad outline of a potential settlement is already visible. The United States and Israel want unrestricted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. They want limits on Iran's nuclear activities. They want stronger verification mechanisms. And they want reduced support for regional proxy groups. Iran, meanwhile, wants sanctions relief, access to frozen assets, security guarantees against future attacks, and recognition of its right to civilian nuclear enrichment. The framework itself is not particularly mysterious. The challenge is that every concession demanded by one side is viewed as a risk by the other.
From Washington's perspective, the priorities are straightforward. Keep Hormuz open, prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, reduce missile threats, and stop the destabilizing activities of armed proxy groups. America isn't looking for promises. It's looking for actions that can be verified. That's the difference.
Iran's priorities are equally understandable. Tehran wants meaningful sanctions relief. It wants frozen assets returned. It wants assurances that concessions will not simply be followed by renewed pressure. And it wants recognition that civilian nuclear development is not the same thing as weaponization. Lasting agreements require both sides to address legitimate security concerns.
The interesting thing is that everyone already knows what the final agreement probably looks like. Hormuz remains open, sanctions are issued gradually, nuclear activities are monitored, both sides declare victory. The real dispute is not over the destination, it is over who takes the first step and who accepts the greater risk.
In other words, everyone has arrived at the negotiating table carrying a remarkably long shopping list. America wants guarantees, Iran wants guarantees, Israel wants guarantees, and somehow nobody wishes to provide them first. It all sounds wonderfully complicated and entirely predictable.
The reality is simple. Verification must come before sanctions relief. Otherwise, we're rewarding promises instead of actions.
And from Tehran's perspective, sanctions relief must begin early. Otherwise, Iran is expected to make concessions without receiving tangible benefits.
Each is we both sides remain stuck. Each wants proof before offering trust.
That is the central problem. Everyone agrees on the broad framework. Nobody agrees on the sequence.
Diplomacy in a nutshell. Everybody agrees where they want to go. They simply cannot agree on who moves first.
So the outline of a deal may already exist: open shipping lanes, sanctions relief, nuclear inspections, security guarantees. The question is whether those pieces can actually be assembled into a lasting peace. Let's go deeper. Let's assume a deal is reached. Hormuz reopens. Sanctions begin to ease. Nuclear inspections are agreed. The paperwork gets signed. What then? What actually makes this agreement survive? Lukas.
Most peace agreements fail for a simple reason. They focus on signing, not implementation. The challenge is not reaching a deal. The challenge is ensuring both sides still follow the deal 6 months later. Any durable agreement requires 3 things: verification, enforcement, and predictability. If either side believes the rules can suddenly change, confidence collapses. Stability depends on reducing uncertainty.
I agree with the verification part, but let's not overcomplicate this. Iran must demonstrate compliance before receiving major benefits. That's how trust is earned. If sanctions disappear first, Washington loses leverage. A deal without enforcement is just a press release.
A sustainable agreement must provide incentives for both sides. If one side receives all the benefits while the other receives only obligations, the agreement will not last. Iran must see tangible economic improvements. America and Israel must see credible security improvements. Balance is essential.
The greatest threat is political pressure. Leaders may sign an agreement, but domestic audiences often punish compromise. Every side will face accusations of weakness. That is, we face saving mechanisms matter. Leaders must be able to present the agreement as a success.
Quite right. Most negotiations are not really about solving problems. They're about solving problems while convincing voters that nothing was sacrificed. A remarkably difficult balancing act.
Verification must come before trust.
Verification must come before trust. Trust is not the starting point. It is usually the result. Cooperation comes first.
History suggests both of you are correct. Agreements require cooperation, but they survive because of verification.
The strongest agreements assume mistrust from the beginning. They do not rely on goodwill. They rely on mechanisms.
In other words, successful diplomacy is largely the art of preparing for human disappointment.
Without consequences, violations become inevitable.
Without fairness, compliance becomes unlikely.
And without predictability, neither side invests in peace. That is the real challenge facing negotiators today.
So perhaps the biggest obstacle isn't writing an agreement, it's creating a system strong enough to survive distrust, which raises the next question. What happens if these negotiations fail? Let's assume the negotiators fail. No lasting agreement, no breakthrough, no grand bargain. What happens next? Buck, start us off.
If negotiations collapse, we return to a cycle of pressure and retaliation. Iran will continue relying on proxies, missile programs, cyber operations, and regional influence. The United States and Israel will continue applying military, economic, and intelligence pressure. Neither side wants a major war, but both sides will continue trying to improve their position. The result is not peace, it's a prolonged standoff.
The greatest concern is that instability becomes normalized. Markets adjust. Governments adapt. People become accustomed to recurring crises. But every unresolved confrontation increases the risk of miscalculation. The longer tensions remain unresolved, the greater the possibility that a relatively small incident triggers a much larger crisis.
I see a frozen conflict. Not peace, not war, something in between. Intelligence operations continue. Cyber attacks continue. Proxy conflicts continue. Economic pressures continues. History teaches that frozen conflicts rarely stay frozen forever.
My prediction is a steady stream of dramatic headlines, emergency meetings, urgent diplomatic visits, serious warnings from governments, followed by temporary calm. Then another crisis, then another summit. Frankly, the entire process resembles a television series that refuses to end, despite running out of new ideas years ago.
The most dangerous outcome is gradual escalation, not because anyone wants a larger conflict, but because repeated crises change expectations. Leaders become more comfortable taking risks. Military forces become more accustomed to confrontation. Over time, behavior that once seemed unacceptable begins to feel normal. That is often how strategic miscalculations develop.
The only way to break that cycle is sustained pressure. Pressure creates resistance. Resistance creates more pressure.
Pressure creates resistance. Resistance creates more pressure.
Neither side appears capable of forcing a decisive outcome.
Which is diplomatic language for saying nobody feels enough pain to compromise yet.
Pressure ended plenty of conflicts throughout history.
And started many others.
History rather inconveniently supports both arguments.
And that may be the real danger. Not a sudden collapse into war, but a slow drift toward the next crisis. So let's move to the darkest possibility of all. What is the true nightmare scenario? Forget what is likely. Forget what diplomats hope will happen. What is the true nightmare scenario if these negotiations collapse completely? Lukas, start us off.
The nightmare scenario is not a single missile strike. It is a collapse of confidence. A major incident in the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping disrupted. Energy markets panic. Governments begin stockpiling resources. Investors lose confidence. Once markets start believing instability is becoming permanent, the economic damage spreads far beyond the Middle East. Financial crises often begin with psychology, not mathematics.
The military nightmare is straightforward. Iran attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz. The United States responds. Israel responds. Regional allies become involved. Suddenly, we're no longer discussing a limited conflict. We're discussing a regional war affecting global energy supplies. The economic consequences would be immediate.
My nightmare scenario is wonderfully simple. Oil hits $300 a barrel. Governments panic, markets panic, voters panic. And suddenly, politicians who spent years arguing about everything discover an urgent passion for peace. Remarkable how diplomatic people become when petrol prices start resembling luxury goods.
I believe the greatest danger is political escalation. Leaders become trapped by domestic pressure. Compromise is portrayed as weakness. Flexibility becomes politically dangerous. At that point, even leaders who want stability may struggle to pursue it. History contains many examples of crises expanding because political space for compromise disappeared.
The nightmare is that leaders begin believing their own rhetoric. They convince themselves the other side will back down. They underestimate risks. They overestimate control. History is full of leaders who believed they were managing a crisis right up until the crisis started managing them. That is how disasters happen.
The reality is that weakness invites aggression, and excessive pressure creates desperation.
And excessive pressure creates desperation.
Both approaches can increase instability if taken too far.
The evidence suggests all three of you are partially correct. Deterrence can prevent conflict. Pressure can create resistance. Fear can preserve temporary stability. But none of those factors build lasting peace.
Marvelous. Well, if diplomacy fails, oil at $300 a barrel may finally unite humanity. Nothing encourages international cooperation quite like expensive petrol one. Does admire the efficiency of international relations.
And perhaps that's the real lesson. Peace may depend less on trust and more on creating systems that function despite mistrust. Final round. One personal verdict from each of you. Can this conflict actually be resolved? Lukas?
Yes. But only if both sides stop chasing perfect outcomes. Durable peace is rarely built on trust. It is built on verification, predictability, and incentives that make breaking the agreement more costly than keeping it.
Peace is possible, but only if Iran accepts meaningful and verifiable limits. Stability comes from deterrence, backed by enforcement. Without consequences, today's ceasefire simply becomes tomorrow's crisis.
A lasting settlement requires mutual compromise. No side will achieve everything it wants. Sustainable peace begins when leaders focus on long-term stability rather than short-term political victories.
Eventually, reality defeats ideology. Every conflict ends at a negotiating table. The tragedy is that leaders often spend years learning what history already taught them.
Quite frankly, this entire situation requires an ugly compromise that nobody particularly likes, which usually means it's probably the correct solution. The sooner everyone accepts that, the better.
5 retired spies, 5 different perspectives. One uncomfortable conclusion. Peace is possible, but only if all sides are willing to accept less than total victory. Which spy's verdict resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy deep geopolitical discussions without political spin, subscribe and join the club. This is Cheesy Bond signing off. Stay sharp, stay thoughtful. We'll see you next time.